Hello and welcome. My name is Miguel Ruiz, head of the Hispanic Reading Room, and on behalf of the Latin American, Caribbean, and European Division and the Manuscript Division and the Library of Congress, it's a pleasure to have you with us this evening. We're delighted to gather in this beautiful space to reflect on the work of a remarkable author whose memoir offers an intimate meditation on her life with her writing partner and husband, Oscar Hijuelos, weaving her voice together with his in a moving exploration of love, memory, and literary partnership. We're joined tonight by Barbara Baer. Barbara is the specialist for literature, culture, and the arts in the manuscript division of the Library of Congress, where she is the curator of the Oscar Hijuelos Papers collection. The Oscar Hijuelos papers were acquired by the Library of Congress in 2023 from Lori Carlson-Hijuelos through the collaboration of the Manuscript Division and the Hispanic Division, and are available for researchers through the Manuscript Division Reading Room. And our special guest of the evening, Lori Carlson-Hijuelos. She is a native of New York State, born in Jamestown, New York. She received her collegiate education in Ohio and Indiana. Following graduate school, she took an editorial position at the Center for Inter-American Relations, now known as the American Society in New York City. There, in 1981, she met her future husband, Oscar Hijuelos, the first Latino to win a Pulitzer Prize in fiction. She began writing full-time in 1990, publishing her first book for children, Where Angels Glide at Dawn, with Harper and Row. Among her best-known work is the bilingual poetry anthology, Cool Salsa, which is now considered a classic by the American Library Association. Her just-released memoir, A Writing Marriage, celebrates her late husband's remarkable novels and their beautiful life together, which was bound by true love, faith, and literature. I'm especially looking forward to this conversation on A Writing Marriage, what Lori beautifully describes as a symbolic unearthing of certain memories and stories that Mercado might understand as a labor necessary to capture the fullness of a history, the ephemera and evidence of, in this case, a love story. Please join me in welcoming Barbara Baer in conversation with Lori Carlson-Hijuelos. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Miguel. And I want to thank you and the audience for coming tonight, and Lori, especially for you to come to talk about your um, life and work with your husband, Oscar Hijuelos, who we honor tonight. I think among the themes of A Writing Marriage are the sentiments of gratitude and of collaboration. And I wanted to start off just expressing some gratitude of my own about collaborations here at the Library of Congress that have brought us to this moment. And first and foremost, we should thank Suzanne Schottel, who is the former director of the Latin American, Caribbean, and European division here at the library. She's now at the University of New Mexico. But she was the guiding light that brought the Oscar Hijuelos papers to the Library of Congress. And it was one of the biggest honors of my career here to work with her on that as a recommending officer. I also want to thank the archivist, Rachel McNellis, who very beautifully arranged the Oscar Hijuelos papers. And she wrote the finding aid that makes it possible to access those papers as a researcher in the Manuscript Division Reading Room. And also, Katie DeFonso, who is here in the audience and is a librarian with the Hispanic Division, and she collaborated with me in creating the display that we have in the back of the reading room, which is of select books that were edited and created by Lori, and many of them have introductions by Oscar Hijuelos, and one of them includes a poem by his mother, Magdalena. And so we're showing those with love and as an example to the audience and the people that visit the reading room in the month of May of the kinds of things that we have available in the general collections here at the library. And there are many more Hijuelos titles. I wanted to ask you a question about titles as your first question. Your husband often said that he came up with the beautiful titles of his novels in his dreams. And I wondered, how did you choose A Writing Marriage as the title of your memoir, and what does it mean to you? What did you want to convey?
So, several people have asked me that question recently, how I came upon the title. And honestly, I heard it. I heard it within me. I did not intellectualize the title. It was a kind of musical riff in my heart. And I realized that what was happening is that I wanted to write about how we collaborated together, and I wanted to create a book that was a collaborative effort. And our writing really did form our marriage. It gave our marriage structure, a contextual form that was quite unusual, I've decided, because I've talked to many writers and they didn't experience the kind of partnership my husband and I had. So I thought it was, when I heard it, I thought, I like it.
Um, Maybe a little later we can get into the question of writing practice and things like, did you read each other's work and that kind of collaboration. But I thought it would be good, especially for those here who might not know much about Oscar's life and your own biography, to look back at childhood and particularly what your childhood and his childhood had to do with the Spanish language, because it's very interesting how you came to that from a different direction. And let's start with Oscar. So he was born in New York City in 1951.
Yes. To Cuban immigrants, and he was born in a very interesting neighborhood on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, which was an immigrant neighborhood, but also very privileged because it happens to be the terrain of Columbia University. So from the very beginning of his life, Oscar was faced with a division, cultural division, societal division of being a poor child, but also in one of the most privileged environments of America, which greatly impressed him and affected him and his worldview and his sense of justice, dignity, and equity. He became very ill on a trip to Cuba when he was 4 and landed in a hospital in Connecticut. And when Oscar was writing his own memoir called Thoughts Without Cigarettes, he did not remember where this hospital was. He had to research to find out that it was near Greenwich, I believe, and now is no longer functioning. But in the process of placing him in this hospital for children who were dying, and he was, the doctors did not think he would live from a very bad case of nephritis, which he contracted in Cuba. We don't know how. He says that he lost his Spanish, but I never believed that because Oscar in his sleep could speak exactly like a native Cubano, and with great flourish and the slang that Cubans use and the rhythmic authenticity of Cuban Spanish. He had a philosophical issue with Spanish. He felt uncomfortable using it for many reasons, I think, but he believed he lost his Spanish. And as a child would not answer his parents once he was out of the hospital in Spanish, only in English. Now, I came to Spanish in an entirely different way. I was born and raised in a small town in upstate New York, Jamestown, New York, which is about an hour and a half south of Buffalo. It's near Pennsylvania and Ohio. And at that time, when I was born in 1957, there was an influx of Puerto Ricans coming to the United States, mainly to New York City. And New York State educators were pretty advanced. They believed in linguistic, let's say, excellence, and they thought it was a good idea to be bilingual and multilingual. And I happened to grow up in a Swedish-Italian household, so I was listening to Swedish and Italian, and I was musical. And my teachers thought I should be put in a program to learn Spanish. So I was selected as one of maybe 5 or 6 kids, and I took Spanish lessons starting in 4th grade in a library. Fell in love with Spanish and knew from the time I was very young that I was being directed by the Lord to study it and inhabit that culture.
You've anticipated a lot of my questions right there. Good job. One of the things that I thought was kind of an interesting statement is that Magdalena's mother said, well, Oscar went into the hospital speaking Spanish and came out of the hospital speaking English. So there was an element of trauma involved in this. And, you know, basically the nurses and so on at the hospital, you know, somewhat similar to Indian boarding schools, were punishing him really for speaking Spanish. And I thought about that, having been a caregiver myself, that one of their concerns may have been that they needed him to be able to express to them how he was feeling, and they needed to be able to communicate with him. But I think that the fact that you as his wife could hear him speaking in his dreams and speaking perfectly, it was all inside him still. And I think one of the beautiful observations you make in A Writing Marriage is that even though he wrote primarily in English, that Spanish so much informs the melody, the lyric, the rhythm of his writing. And he was such a beautiful lyrical writer.
Yes, so when I was in high school, I remember I had an AP history teacher and an AP English teacher. And the message from educators at that time, and I presume it's still pretty much the case, is that in English you should be cogent and concise and use the fewest words possible to convey a message. But in Spanish, it's quite different. The more lyrical you are, the more verso you have in your explanation of something, the better you are, and the better a writer you are. So if you read, let's say, Iberian writers or the classic writers from Spain, you'll find that there's a lot of flourish and a lot of poetry and a lot of description. And Oscar's mother was an exemplar of that style in her conversation and in her writing. She was a poet. And Oscar, being sick and sickly, even after he came out of the hospital, was always next to Magda for a few years. He entered, I think, 1st grade a little late and then accelerated because he was so bright. But his mother was educating him about language, and he didn't realize that that was what was happening. So I would agree with you. His writing is symphonic. It is very typical of the Spanish vein of artistry. It's not about being precise or about explaining something simply.
Well, and he has that in common with, you know, great Latin American writers as well. So to me, when I read the first chapter of Our House in the Last World, which was his first novel published in 1983, it's such a beautiful lyrical chapter, but it's partly about his mother being a poet and the history of poetry and storytelling in the family. And I was thinking that, you know, at one point he talked in his own memoir about growing up in a household that didn't have books except the World Book Encyclopedia. My mother bought the World Book Encyclopedia too. But that, as you say, that he was getting texts through oral history, through music and through song and through the stories and the way that his mother expressed herself.
Another, an advantage of growing up on the campus of Columbia University, of course, was that there were students in Oscar's building, and these students would throw away their textbooks under the stairwell, and Oscar would find them and would read anything that was there. He just couldn't wait to get his hands on any text. So he often joked about this. He was reading about agriculture and reading about the body and biology and law and just about everything and anything from the time he was in elementary school. He was hungry to learn.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted to ask you about that, about sort of his education path, and that clearly reading was an extraordinarily important part of it. And for you too, that you said that in the book that you were a young reader and it was very important to you. Can you tell us a little bit about, I know that he went to a Catholic school for a while, and then where did he go to college?
Oscar went to Corpus Christi Elementary School, which was a school associated with his church, a few blocks from where he lived. A very important church. Thomas Merton was a member of that church. And it's also beautiful and has gorgeous music, a great choir. And then he went to junior high and high school, well, junior high school for a while at a Catholic school, but his father couldn't afford what I would consider, and a lot of Americans would consider, a reasonable amount of money. It was something like $20 a month. And so Oscar then went to a public school and became truant, because the public school he attended on the Upper West Side was known for violence, stabbings, terrible violence, actually. And Oscar decided he didn't want to be a part of it. So he didn't go to classes his last 2 years of high school. But because he was so intelligent and he was constantly reading, he aced all of his exams, SATs, etc., and graduated. It's interesting that because in, I think, around 2004 or 5, Carolyn Kennedy awarded him a very prestigious honor as being one of the most important citizens of New York City who graduated from a public high school. She was promoting public school education. I was very proud of him for that. But yeah, so he had a Catholic and public school education and then went to City College.
And he had some important mentors at City College.
He did. Susan Sontag, Donald Barthelme, and Fred Tutton were his most important teachers, professors.
So I want to say to the parents out there, make available books, and the importance of mentoring younger people. In your own work as an editor, you've done many collections of Latino poetry and children's books, and Oscar collaborated in some of those. What was kind of your inspiration for wanting to do specifically books for young people?
I have had a very privileged and interesting career. I mentioned that I felt directed by God in my study of Spanish, and I, from the time I was 13 years old, actually saw my future, and I knew very important things about my adult life. My friends always thought it was hilarious because I would tell them, I'm going to be working with ambassadors and I'm going to be working with cultural attachés. And they would look at me puzzled, how is that going to happen? And I said, oh yes, I'm going to have this amazing life, and I know I'm going to marry someone who will be very famous. And they wanted to know how I knew that, and I knew it in my heart. I just heard it. So I excelled in my studies at the College of Worcester in Worcester, Ohio, and it was time to decide if I wanted to go on, and I did. And my professor said, well, you've got to enter a doctoral program. And one of my professors, my mentor actually, took a leave of absence my senior year. He wanted me to carry on his work at the University of Michigan. But the interim director of the department said, no way, you're going to Indiana University in Bloomington. That's where you belong, and I don't think you should be studying linguistics. You have to get your doctorate in Latin American Lit, like me. So I visited several programs and got quite a few interesting offers, grants, and after meeting with the directors of several of those departments, I decided on IU because it was such a bold, huge Spanish language program, and I wanted to be a part of a big school. So while I was there studying, I once again felt directed and knew that I wasn't meant to be a scholar sitting in an office at a university writing about work. I was meant to work with writers. I knew this. And my professors were furious at me because I said, I'm not going to complete my doctoral studies. What? No, I'm going to New York City. And I remember one of my professors said, Lori, what on earth are you going to do? How are you going to survive? And I said, the Lord will provide. He thought I was crazy. I went to New York City on my 23rd birthday, and the next day I was walking down, I know this is a long history, but it is important to understand how I ended up doing what I have done. I walked down Park Avenue and I noticed a bronze plaque on the facade of a beautiful mansion, and the name was Center for Inter-American Relations. And I knew that that center published a very important scholarly journal, which I had been using in graduate school, Review Latin American Literature and Art. I walked in, I asked to meet the director of literature, and the receptionist looked at me and said, well, do you have an appointment? No. She called up and she said, well, she's got a few minutes, go on up. And I did, and I met the director, and she was also the managing editor of the magazine. And we had a beautiful chat, and she said, I'm sorry, there is nothing here for you to do in terms of a job, but please come next week to one of our programs. The center was the most important organization for Latin American relations, and it was responsible for providing all of the money to translate the boom writers. And I don't know how many of you know about the boom writers, but it was a generation of Latin American writers that put Latin American lit on the map, like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the Nobel Prize winner, Mario Vargas Llosa, the Peruvian novelist, so many, Carlos Fuentes, the Mexican novelist, Miguel. And so we had a lovely chat, and I got up and thanked her, and as I was leaving, she said, come on back. She was Bolivian, and her name was Rosario Santos. Please sit down. Yes, I do have a job for you. Can you start tomorrow? Really? Yes. How about working on the magazine as an editorial assistant? And that began a career at this most important organization founded by David Rockefeller. And David Rockefeller was, in fact, my ultimate boss. So I went from Indiana University in 1 week to working for David Rockefeller. And within weeks, I was working with cultural attachés, ambassadors, editors, and realized over the next few years that there was this enormous immigration coming to the United States, and that there were children, Spanish-speaking children, who didn't have proper books or books that would enhance their understanding of what it meant to be an American, and books that would give them support and help them find their voice. And so I decided I was going to focus on these children. And because I was working with many famous editors, I would tell them what I was doing. Oh, that sounds nice, yeah, huh? But who are these Latinos? I've never heard of Latinos. The word wasn't even used back in 1981, 82, 83. And so finally, I got an agent, and she tried to sell my first book and couldn't, and eventually did, and it was a huge hit. And that began my career.
And the other thing that was really wonderful about being at the center is you met your famous husband there.
I did.
1981, you were
Yes.
introduced, but you
Mhm.
really got to know him better in 1983 because you were one of the first readers of Our House in the Last World.
I believe I was the first presenter of Our House in the Last World and one of the first readers, yes.
And the program was called Books and Breakfast. Yeah.
Yeah. What I had decided by then was that the Center for Inter-American Relations, now known as the Americas Society, was and still is a membership organization for basically very well-heeled, very affluent CEOs and American businessmen, lawyers, and executives from companies that have to do business in Latin America, and they didn't know anything about Latin American literature. And I thought, well, what a great opportunity. I can allow them to meet all of these famous Latin American novelists. And I created this idea of having a breakfast program because everybody in New York City was on their way to work by 8:39, and it would start around 7:30, books and breakfast. And it was a hit. And so I was meeting the CEOs of Ford and major companies and became a friend of many of these people and tried to convey to them that if they were working in Latin America, they ought to understand the culture of these people, not just how to make money. I was so young and naive, and I thought that this was
That there was something else
that they would be
money.
yeah. But it was very successful, and Oscar.
Well, congratulations.
And I presented Oscar at one of those. Yes.
And so that's how you met, but you didn't really get together until about 1989, is that right? And what else happened in 1989? There was kind of a big book that came out that year.
So Oscar and I became friends. I had hundreds of authors who were my friends because my job was to try to get them published at Knopf and FSG and Harper and Row and Viking and Pantheon, all of these different wonderful presses. And Oscar knew that I was being successful in doing this. So he would invite me occasionally to his apartment and read from this book. He didn't have a title yet. And I remember often he would read passages about ghosts, and those passages never made it into the novel. He took them out. But we lost touch after he won the Rome Prize for Our House in the Last World. He went off to Italy. But when he came back, I would see him occasionally at functions. And then in 1989, I got a call from Oscar, and his exact words were, "This is a voice from your past." Okay. And can you figure out who it is? No. And Oscar, "I'd like to invite you to dinner." I said, "Oh, wonderful. Okay, great." And he said, "Because you helped me so much with my novel that is about to be published in just a few weeks, The Mambo Kings Play Songs of Love."
And it was an overnight sensation and made him into a celebrity. And here you were in this new relationship, and suddenly he's very famous and is in demand for interviews. And it must have felt strange to kind of want him to yourself and have a private life at the same time that he was kind of rocketing into the stratosphere of fame. How did that feel for you?
Confusing, exciting, exhilarating, upsetting, all of those things, because Oscar's success was literally overnight. He had been told by his editor not to expect anything because books about Hispanic culture did not sell in America. And they were right. For the most part, they didn't. And it was very rare for a writer of Oscar's ethnic background to even be considered to be published. It just didn't happen. It's hard for Americans to believe that now, but that's how it was. And so Oscar told me, I'm gonna go off to Portugal because I don't wanna be disappointed. I've worked so hard on this novel, I'm gonna be crushed. Nothing will happen. And off he went. And I would get on the bus every morning going to another job. Now, I was an editor-in-chief at a new company. And I would open the New York Times on the bus, and there was a full-page ad for the Mambo Kings with yet another major quote from yet another major newspaper. I thought, wow, what's going on? Something is happening. And when Oscar came back from Portugal, his life exploded, literally. It was nonstop TV, interviews, radio, and the rights to the novel were being sold all over the world. It's in about 40 languages now. And, well, Oscar had become famous.
He had, and in 1990, he won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, which made him the first Latino American to win that.
That's right.
In a time where you point out in a writing marriage, Hispanic literature was very marginalized.
Totally.
So it was an amazing thing that happened.
Yeah, today we take it for granted that Hispanics are so much a part of our culture now, and we have such a different environment. But back then, to be Latino and to have made it, especially in the literary world, was extraordinary. And people from every discipline and every entertainment group were coming to Oscar to meet him. It was not uncommon for rock stars to be in Oscar's lobby. They would just stand there and wait till he came home. Famous artists were calling, painters, sculptors. It was overwhelming. Actors. It was truly overwhelming.
But one of the beautiful things about it is that it made it possible for him to then pursue writing as a career and not have to work a 9-to-5 advertising executive kind of job that he had to do earlier in his life.
Right.
So in some ways, the fame freed him because it gave him more of a chance to have new contracts for books and so on.
Actually, he was more courageous than that because he quit his 9-to-5 after he won the Rome Prize, which did not ensure him of, let's say, a particular kind of comfortable life, but he knew that he had the talent to be able to pursue the life he wanted. He was willing to risk it, and he never thought he would be wealthy. He never thought that he would make that kind of money, and he never thought he would be able to live off of his writing. But he wanted to devote himself to his art, and he did before he won a Pulitzer.
I wanted to segue now back to a writing marriage and you as a writer and the way that you constructed the book. I'm very struck that it is in fact a collaboration, and if we look at the cover, a writing marriage, a memoir by Lori Carlson-Hijuelos and Oscar, with Oscar Hijuelos. And so you wrote it with Oscar, I'm sure with Oscar in mind and feeling his presence and his inspiration. But also, what else did you do that was unusual in constructing a memoir in terms of his writing?
Well, once I realized that Oscar had a 2,000-page manuscript by the title of Blue Antiquity. It also had another title, So Imagine Mercado. But that was unfinished. I realized, and it was gorgeous because I started reading it when the archivist told me about it. Even though Oscar had shared excerpts of it with me over the years. He had been working on this manuscript for decades, but I had no idea how important it had become to him. I realized that the protagonist, as I was reading it, was pretty much Oscar.
Victor Mercado. Yeah.
In a different guise, in a different setting, because Victor Mercado is a scholar and a classicist and an archaeologist whose area of expertise is the time and life of Christ. And I was going through a truly hellish period of grieving. I'm out of it now, but I'm still not where I was before I lost him. But I'm much better. And my faith is what allowed me to get through these past 12 years. So even though I've always been a very God-fearing woman and Christianity has always been at the center of my life, I truly delved into what it meant to be a woman of faith. And I realized that if I could not find God in such pain and sorrow, then I really hadn't connected with the divine. So I was thinking about what it meant to be a woman of God. And then I found this manuscript, and I knew that I had to go home for a while because my mother was ill. She's 93. And look after her, and I needed a quiet place in which to write. And I thought of her church, which is a cathedral in my hometown. And I asked the pastor if I could write in the church. And I asked if I could just have a small room, a Sunday school room. But he said, no, I'm putting you in the library. And so I wrote the memoir in a library, and as I was thinking about my faith and about Victor Mercado, it became clear to me that mixing the voices and Oscar's persona through Victor and my searching for God, as was Victor Mercado, had to be put together. So that's also a writing marriage.
It is, and I just want to say for the audience that those drafts of Blue Antiquity or So Imagine Mercado are part of what we have in the manuscript division in the Oscar Hijuelos papers. We have 10 boxes of drafts that he created and that you drew from for the excerpts in the book. So the book is really written in textually in tandem, where you have chapters of memories of your own, but you intersperse these long excerpts in some cases from Blue Antiquity. You're talking about God and your faith in God and writing in a sacred space to create this memoir. Could you tell us a little bit about, well, I guess I'll back up and say that, Blue Antiquity is also about a search for God. That's one of the things that Oscar's character is undergoing, is questioning his Catholic upbringing, whether there is a God, and it becomes very metaphysical. So could you tell us a little bit about Oscar's spirituality that seems to have come from many different sources?
Oscar's mother, Magdalena Torrens, was a very spiritual woman and a very religious woman, both. Her spirituality was drawn from her interesting Cuban cultural heritage, which can be not entirely Christian. It combines all sorts of interesting thinking and various religious ideologies, but she was also very Catholic. And she was a huge influence on my husband in her poetry, her thinking, her verbosity, her flair, her love of Cuban culture. She spent so much time with him when he was a child. So she really was a kind of muse for Oscar. And I remember from the time that we started dating, actually from the first date, we talked about what God meant to us. I know it's not a sexy thing to say, but it's the truth. And I was raised in a very Lutheran home. So we had a lot to discuss because my mother was a Sunday school teacher. My father was on the council of my Lutheran church. I taught Bible school in the summer. And both of us discovered that the Bible itself had been a huge influence on not only the way we thought, but the way we thought about writing, because we both believe that the Old Testament in particular, but also Paul's letters, are among the most beautiful pieces of writing ever. So Oscar and I connected through our faith, through our love of literature, and of course we were also attracted to each other. It was everything. But yes, he was a person of great, let's say, devotion, who did not attend church. He did for Easter and Sunday with me, Easter and Christmas with me, but he was not a church-going person.
But he went some other places. I wanted to talk a little, you talk quite a bit in the book about travel, the importance of Rome to both of you, and the gardens, and so at the American Academy. But I'm thinking more about your passages describing his trips to the Himalayas, to Nepal. And he had a kind of epiphany spiritual experience. It was almost supernatural in the Himalayas. Do you want to tell us about that?
Well, he had several, and he told me about them and asked that I never convey them to anyone, but I decided to convey one in my memoir. And it was an experience with a being, a kind of spiritual being that had nothing to do with iconography that we would recognize as Christian. It was a strange creature in the sky, a very benevolent, strange creature. And I know he wasn't making this up. It wasn't something that he just dreamt up or imagined. It was real because Oscar was that kind of person. He was detailed and did not lie. So he told me what this creature was like and that it beckoned him when he felt like he couldn't keep going. And he described the physiology of this thing. But he also had other experiences that I haven't related. And they are mystical, truly mystical. I think Oscar's understanding of God was very broad and very artistic and beyond that what we would call as Christian, but he was very Catholic in his thinking.
And influenced a bit by Buddhism as well.
Yeah.
And Buddhist friends, you mentioned that also in the memoir. We're getting a little bit short on time. We want to have some questions, but I wanted to read a short passage from the book, and then I'd like you to read the postlude if you wouldn't mind doing that. And this is going back to one of the themes in Blue Antiquity, that Victor Mercado is, like Oscar, was very interested in archaeology and archaeology and digs. And you have some excerpts in A Writing Marriage that are expressly about that. But this is something that you wrote in the chapter that's called, I have to look closer with my glasses, Routines and Breaking Them. Okay. It has often occurred to me since Oscar's death, and we should say to those who don't know that I'm very sorry, Lori, that he died suddenly in October of 2013, that I too have an archaeological life, although it hasn't taken the form that the adjective commonly suggests. I have ruminated on our experiences and travels. I have waded through hundreds upon hundreds, thousands really, of my husband's writings, notes, diaries, correspondence, photos, books, drawings, and collections. I have engaged in conversations about him with friends and old pals, in his orbit before he and I met, mutual acquaintances, and sometimes admirers and readers of his work, whom I do not know at all, and I have meditated and prayed in ways that are familiar as well as new and mysterious to me. I had not anticipated that I would have this kind of painfully creative journey at this juncture in my life. So I think archaeology in the book is used metaphorically as well. And of course, here at the library, we love that you're using it to take a deep dive into the manuscripts. That's the Made at the Library theme for tonight. And I had planned to ask at the end what you want us all to know about Oscar, but you really addressed that well in the postlude. And so if you would read those pages for us, that would be lovely.
Okay. So these are just a few paragraphs from the postlude. It is an in-between time for me as I finish this book and reflect upon the last 2 years of living in my hometown. A very dear pal of mine, a true best friend, unexpectedly died a week ago, and my constant rumination of our lifelong friendship has added to the ponderance of this moment. In reflecting on her life with her devoted husband, John, I realized that her marriage and mine were foundational marriages, the kind which serve and nourish, sustain, and empower. What I find interesting, though, is that almost nothing about our marriages was similar in nature except for their rock-solid character. That shared vision element is what gave our marriages their longevity. And that's a reference to something I say in the prelude, which is that I came upon a book by a minister in Rome that said he'd always been wrong about which marriages would last and which wouldn't. And after many years of seeing the marriages that he thought would be good and strong fail, he realized that there was one common element, and that was a shared vision of their future. As long as the two had that commitment to a shared vision, that marriage would last. So that's what that means. I realized that a marriage such as mine with Oscar will never end. It has changed shape and character now that he is gone, but it endures. It simply has a hold on me. I guess it's because I married my soulmate. Until now, I very matter-of-factly used this figure of speech to describe how I felt about Oscar, but I think I must demand of myself a clear understanding of what it meant to have a soulmate in my husband. I want to be precise. If I think about the attributes of Oscar's nature, the fact that he was incredibly bold and aspirational, childlike, curious, passionate, garrulous, driven, spiritual, and Catholic in tone, social, intellectual, hyper-creative, vibrant, buoyant, musical, reverent, gentlemanly, protective, sweet and open, introspective, compassionate, generous, playful, witty, articulate. You can tell I really love my husband. There would be one above all others that is salient for me. He was the unseen outline within which I fit perfectly. A human design made just for my being, divinely bespoke, that elevated my nature and brought me closer to eternity.
It's a beautiful love story, and we thank you for it.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
We do have a little time for questions from the audience, and Allison has a mic. There we go.
Thank you very much. That was beautiful. If I heard correctly at the beginning of your talk, you said that your marriage of two authors was different from marriages of two authors that you encountered. And if you'd be willing to elaborate on that. And then I would like to know, what was an average day like in your marriage of two authors? Thank you.
Sure. I'm going to try to explain this. Oscar and I had a very beautiful community of friends who were writers, married couples who were writers. It turns out that because I was writing for children and young adults, which is not an area that in New York City is considered to be, let us say, esoteric or fancy or special or worthy of commentary, because you're right, this is how it is, and I'm dealing with it still. You're writing for kids and or young adults, which is not of interest to major American novelists. And all of our friends, our married couple friends who were writers, were both novelists, writing for adults, and in the papers equally so. So what happened, and it's an interesting question that you ask, or that you point, the issue is interesting, because believe it or not, people I've known and still know in this group do not think of me as a writer. They don't even know I write. And kind of, I remember, and I say this in my memoir, the husband of a very well-known writer whose work you would know, once asked me, "Do you do anything?" And I've published 18 books. But because these books were not being reviewed by, let's say, the critics of the New York Times, or I wasn't in the New Yorker, as was my husband, and all of them, I was dismissed as I don't know what. I still don't know what they think. Does that answer the question?
What did Oscar think?
Oh, he was furious at them. He was such a supportive husband. He loved my work and he knew what I was doing. But I never sought the limelight. And a lot of people in New York City, unfortunately, in literary arts, feel that unless you're in the paper, unless you're a profiled author in the New Yorker, unless you're in the New York Review of Books and your work is being talked about by the cohort in which you socialize, then you're, you're fiddling around, you're that kind of thing. Now, what was your second question? An average day was, and I talk about that too, very well, okay. Getting up in the morning, eating breakfast in silence, making sure that there was classical music on, making sure that my husband had his favorite combination of cereals and fruit. Then my husband saying, "So long, I'll see you tonight," and off he would go till 8 o'clock. And then I would also write, but along with my writing, I was making arrangements for a trip to Sweden, Germany, Japan. I was talking to agents, I was talking to editors, I was making sure that all the dry cleaning was done and the packing was done, and that I was answering correspondence, that I was helping him by going to the library, researching, getting books for him. I was many, many things for my husband because I wanted him to be able to devote all of his time to producing the books that were in his soul. I recognized that Oscar was a truly unique, special, extraordinary artist. And I never cared about getting the same kind of recognition. It didn't matter to me. So all of my friends and my family too felt that somehow I was not giving myself the kind of attention that I ought to be giving to myself. I didn't care because in my view, Oscar was a gift to humankind. I really do believe that. His work, in my view, has changed human beings. When you read a novel by Oscar Hijuelos, it's hard to forget what you've just read. It changes you. If you read Mr. Ives' Christmas, you are not the same person you were before you read Mr. Ives' Christmas. If you read A Simple Havana Melody, you are not going to be the same person you were before you read that novel. That is how important an artist he was, in my view.
Do we have other questions?
So were his writing done by hand, or was it typed on the computer?
Initially, it was typed, and then also reworked by hand, and then computer and reworked by hand.
You can see some examples. We have a loop running in the back when you're going, take a look there. So I did include some examples from the manuscript division collection that shows his writing, especially of Blue Antiquity. They're pages from Blue Antiquity. So you can see it's typed and then edited by ink and then retyped. And we have many, many versions. Lori was telling me earlier that one of the ways he worked was just by producing version after version, and they're typed. But we also have notebooks, so we have boxes of notebooks that are handwritten. And one of the things I noticed too is that he loved to draw. And we didn't get into the sort of the lighter side of things, but he loved comic books, he loved Donald Duck. And I look at his notebooks, the handwritten notebooks with the illustrations drawn in them, and think, I wonder if he had lived into a newer era when the graphic novel became a kind of standard format, he would have been a natural to create a graphic novel.
Yeah.
But also, some of the illustrations are hard to interpret exactly what he's drawing, but some of them are of himself as the devil, which is interesting. We have an example in the back of it's called Lori's Wine Glass, and he drew your favorite pink wine glass. But I wonder, there was something in those notebooks that I saw, and I thought, what is that? And I'm wondering if it's that supernatural creature that he saw in Nepal, because the way you describe it in A Writing Marriage is what this illustration looks like. So, but part of his creative process is, I think that he did a lot of trial lines. One of the last books, I think it was published posthumously, was the Twain and Stanley Go to Paradise.
Enter Paradise.
Enter Paradise, yes. An important distinction, Enter Paradise. But one of the notebooks is, definitely him thinking through this particular novel and writing about Mark Twain and writing about Stanley. So, yeah.
Yeah.
I think we have to call it a night.
Just
did
real
you have
quick,
one more
yeah,
question?
The
Sure.
second part is more of a comment. What you wrote about your husband and all the lovely words and description, I have to borrow that for my dating profile.
You're more than welcome. Thank you, everyone, for spending time with us tonight and for taking time out of your busy day to do this, to come here in this exquisite place. I have to say, I told Barbara that being at the Library of Congress for me is not only thrilling, but it has restored my faith in this country, because I've been watching Americans come into this library and truly being curious about literature and what makes this nation tick, and thinking and creating. And it's, for me, and being from New York City, it has been a healing afternoon. So thank you very, very much.
It's lively live at the library. So thank you so much for coming this evening.
Thank you.